Could a queen be executed based on whispers? Was a woman who changed the course of English history condemned by gossip and lies? Did a supposed extra finger and a mole on her neck seal her fate, or was it the political plotting of men who once called her a friend? The story of Anne Boleyn is not just history. It is a maze of rumors, a collection of tales told by her enemies, spun into a web that ultimately led her to the scaffold. We think we know her, but much of what we believe comes from a script written to justify her death. Separating the woman from the myth is a task that still puzzles historians today. Number 21 is her ghost still haunting the Tower of London. The Tower of London has seen more than 900 years of English history. Executions on Tower Green were rare, reserved for those of high rank. Anne Boleyn was one of them. In the centuries since her death on May 19, 1536, stories have grown. People say she still walks the grounds. She is not the only ghost said to haunt the tower, but she is the most famous. The most common story is of her walking the corridors of the White Tower or near the Queen's house, where she was imprisoned. Sometimes she is described as a white, misty figure. Other times she appears fully formed, wearing the gray dress she supposedly wore during her final days. The most dramatic version of the tale has her leading a ghostly procession of lords and ladies down the aisle of the Chapel Royal of St. Peter ad Vincula. This is where her body was buried under the stone floor. In these stories, she is often seen carrying her own head under her arm. These sightings are not just old folklore. One of the most detailed accounts came from a soldier in the 19th century. In 1864, a sentry on duty at the Queen's house claimed to see a white figure approaching him. He challenged it, but it kept coming. He lunged at it with his bayonet, only to pass right through it and faint from the shock. The story goes that he was court-martialed for dereliction of duty, but other soldiers and an officer testified that they too had seen the apparition from a window. The charges were dropped. Is there any truth to it? Probably not. The stories about Anne's ghost did not appear right after her death. They seem to have gained popularity in the Victorian era, a time when people were fascinated with ghost stories and the romance of the past. The image of the tragic queen, betrayed and executed, was a powerful one. Her story was perfect for a haunting tale. The detail about carrying her head is a classic ghost trope, applied to many other historical figures who were beheaded. Historians see these tales as folklore, not fact. They tell us more about how later generations viewed Anne than about any real supernatural events. She became a symbol of wronged innocence. A ghost story was a way to express that feeling. The tower itself encourages these legends. They are good for tourism, but they also keep the memory of Anne Boleyn alive, even if it is a spooky, distorted version of her real life. Number 20 was her marriage to Henry, ever legally valid. Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church to marry Anne Boleyn. He declared his first marriage, a union of 24 years to Catherine of Aragon, null and void. He created the Church of England, making himself its supreme head. All of this was done so his marriage to Anne would be legal, and their children would be legitimate heirs to the throne. Yet, just days before her execution, that same marriage was declared invalid. The problem was a man named Henry Percy. He was the 6th Earl of Northumberland. Before Anne ever caught the eye of King Henry, she was a young woman at court serving Queen Catherine. Percy was also at court, a young man in the household of Cardinal Wolsey. He and Anne fell for each other. Around 1523, they reached an understanding. They made what was called a pre-contract of marriage. In the eyes of the church at that time, a pre-contract was a serious, legally binding agreement. It was essentially a promise to marry, and if it was followed by a physical relationship, it was considered a full marriage that could only be undone by the church. Cardinal Wolsey found out about their arrangement. He was furious. The king may have already had his eye on Anne, or perhaps Wolsey just felt Percy was marrying beneath his station. Whatever the reason, Wolsey publicly scolded Percy and broke the engagement. Percy was sent home and forced to marry another woman, Mary Talbot, a marriage that turned out to be deeply unhappy. And Anne was sent away from court for a time. She never forgave Wolsey. This old story was mostly forgotten. But in May 1536, when Henry and his chief minister Thomas Cromwell needed a way to get rid of Anne, they remembered the pre-contract. If Anne had been legally pre-contracted to Henry Percy, then her marriage to King Henry was never valid in the first place. It would mean their daughter Elizabeth was illegitimate. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was sent to the Tower to question Anne. Under immense pressure just before her death, she may have confessed to something that allowed Cranmer to annul the marriage. At the same time, Henry Percy was called before the King's Council. He was a sick man by this point. He swore on the Holy Sacrament that there had never been a formal contract between him and Anne. The council believed him, but it didn't matter. They had what they needed from Anne. On May 17, 1536, Cranmer declared the marriage null and void. This meant Henry was a bachelor again, free to marry Jane Seymour. It also meant that when Anne was executed 2 days later, she wasn't technically killed as an adulterous queen, but as a fornicator. It was a legal nicety in a brutal political game. Historians still debate what exactly Anne confessed to, and whether the pre-contract was real or just a convenient excuse. Number 19, did Jane Seymour play a role in plotting against her? Jane Seymour is often portrayed as the opposite of Anne Boleyn. She was quiet, gentle, and meek, where Anne was outspoken, fiery, and ambitious. Her history remembers her as the queen who finally gave Henry VIII the son he craved and who died shortly after. She is seen as a passive figure, a pawn in the plans of her ambitious family, but some historians wonder if she was more involved in Anne's downfall than it seems. The Seymour family was certainly on the rise. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas, were ambitious men who saw the king's growing dissatisfaction with Anne as an opportunity. As Anne failed to produce a son, miscarrying a male fetus in January 1536, Henry's eye began to wander. The Seymours made sure Jane was there for it to land on. She was placed in the Queen's household as a lady-in-waiting, just as Anne had been in Catherine of Aragon's. The king began to court Jane openly. He sent her gifts. There is a famous story where Henry sent Jane a purse full of gold coins along with a letter. Jane, in front of many people at court, kissed the letter but refused the purse. She told the messenger to tell the king that she was a gentlewoman of good family and that she had no greater treasure than her honor, which she would not sell for any price. She said if the king wished to give her a gift, she prayed it would be when God sent her a good and honorable husband. This was a very clever move. It signaled to Henry that she would not be his mistress, just as Anne had done years before. It made her seem virtuous and desirable. Was this her own idea, or was she coached by her brothers and their political allies? It's impossible to know, but her behavior put immense pressure on Anne. The queen knew she was being replaced in the king's affections by her own lady-in-waiting. The Spanish ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who hated Anne, reported that Jane and her family were working with those who opposed Anne at court. They were feeding the king's doubts and encouraging his interest in Jane. When Anne was arrested, Jane was moved into royal apartments at Greenwich Palace. This was a clear sign that her status had changed. Henry was courting her while his wife was on trial for her life. On the very day Anne was executed, May 19, 1536, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. They married just 11 days later. The speed of it all is shocking. It suggests that the outcome of Anne's trial was a foregone conclusion, and the plan for Henry's next marriage was already in place. Jane may not have been the main architect of Anne's fall, a role usually assigned to Thomas Cromwell, but she and her family certainly positioned themselves to benefit from it. They watched, they waited, and they played their part perfectly. Number 18 was Thomas Cromwell, the architect of her downfall. Thomas Cromwell was a blacksmith's son who rose to become Henry VIII's most powerful minister. He was a brilliant politician, a master of detail, and utterly ruthless. For years, he and Anne Boleyn were allies. They worked together to push for the break with Rome and advance the Protestant Reformation in England. Cromwell helped draft the legislation that made Henry the head of the church and that secured the Boleyn marriage. They were a team. But by 1536, their relationship had soured. Historians have long argued about why they fell out. One major point of disagreement was money. After Henry dissolved the monasteries, a huge amount of wealth flowed to the crown. Anne wanted to use that money to fund charitable and educational institutions in line with her reformist religious beliefs. Cromwell, a pragmatist, wanted the money to go directly into the king's empty coffers. This created a fundamental conflict over policy. Another area of friction was foreign policy. Anne favored an alliance with France. Cromwell was beginning to think an alliance with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, was a better strategic move. To make an alliance with Charles, Henry would have to repair his relationship with him. Getting rid of Anne, the source of the original break, would be a big step in that direction. The traditional view put forward by historian Eric Ives is that Cromwell and Anne had a major falling out in the spring of 1536. Cromwell realized that Anne's influence over the king was a threat to his own power and his political agenda. He also saw that the king was deeply unhappy with Anne. Henry was desperate for a male heir, and he was already infatuated with Jane Seymour. The king wanted out of his marriage. Cromwell, seeing the writing on the wall, decided to act. He didn't just facilitate the king's wishes, he orchestrated the entire plot. He manufactured the evidence against Anne and the 5 men accused with her. He used his vast network of spies and his control of the legal system to build a case that, while flimsy, was good enough to get a conviction from a terrified court. A different view, argued by historian G.W. Bernard, suggests Cromwell was simply following the king's orders. In this interpretation, Henry himself was the driving force. He had become convinced that Anne was guilty of adultery and had even used witchcraft to trap him. He believed his lack of a son was God's punishment for his marriage to her. In this scenario, Cromwell was just the loyal servant carrying out the brutal task his master demanded. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The king wanted Anne gone. Cromwell saw an opportunity to solve a political problem for his master and remove a powerful rival at the same time. He used his formidable skills to make it happen quickly and decisively. He gathered whispers and gossip, pressured witnesses, and constructed a legal case for treason. It was a masterpiece of political destruction. Whether he did it out of self-preservation or on direct orders, Cromwell's hands were all over the plot that sent Anne Boleyn to the scaffold. Number 17, did she poison Catherine of Aragon? Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died on January 7th, 1536. She had been living in forced exile for years, separated from her daughter Mary, and refusing to accept the annulment of her marriage or Anne's title as queen. Her death was a significant event. For Henry, it removed a major obstacle. As long as Catherine lived, a large portion of the country and most of Europe viewed her as the rightful queen and Anne as a usurper. Her death simplified things. When Catherine's body was embalmed, the embalmer noticed that her heart was black and had a strange black growth on it. He reported this. When the news reached the Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, he was immediately suspicious. Chapuis was loyal to Catherine and despised Anne. He concluded that the black heart was a clear sign of poison. He wrote to his master, the Emperor Charles V, sharing his suspicions. The rumor quickly spread that Queen Anne had finally succeeded in poisoning her rival. This rumor fit perfectly with the image of Anne that her enemies had created. They saw her as a ruthless, ambitious woman who would stop at nothing to secure her position. Poison was considered a woman's weapon, sneaky and cowardly. Accusing Anne of poisoning Catherine made her seem even more monstrous. Some reports even claimed that when the news of Catherine's death reached court, Henry and Anne dressed in yellow and celebrated. While they did wear yellow, in Spain, yellow was a color of royal mourning, a detail that was lost on English observers who saw it as a sign of inappropriate joy. But did she actually do it? Almost all modern historians agree that she did not. Poisoning was very difficult to prove in the 16th century, but the description of Catherine's heart is consistent with a medical condition, not poison. The black growth was most likely a secondary tumor from a form of cancer, probably melanoma. Cancer of the heart is very rare, but it does occur, and it would explain the symptoms described. There was also no political reason for Anne to poison Catherine at that point. Catherine was isolated and posed no immediate threat. Her death was actually convenient for Anne, as it opened the door for a possible reconciliation between Henry and the Emperor Charles V. It made Anne's position seem more secure, not less. Furthermore, no one was ever formally accused or investigated for the poisoning. It remained purely at the level of rumor and suspicion, fueled by the political hatred directed at Anne. The story of the poisoning tells us a lot about the toxic atmosphere of the Tudor court and the willingness of Anne's enemies to believe the absolute worst about her. Number 16, did she have an affair with her own brother, George? Of all the shocking charges brought against Anne Boleyn, the accusation of incest with her brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was the most heinous. It was a crime against God and nature, a charge designed to utterly destroy her reputation and make her execution seem not just necessary, but righteous. George Boleyn was a talented and charismatic courtier. He was a poet, a diplomat, and a close friend and advisor to the king. He and Anne were known to be very close, as siblings often are. They shared similar reformist religious views and a sharp, witty intelligence. Their enemies, however, chose to interpret this closeness in the most sinister way possible. The case against them was incredibly thin. The main evidence came from George's own wife, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Jane had a difficult relationship with her husband and her sister-in-law. According to later sources, she told Thomas Cromwell that on one occasion she had seen George in his sister's chambers for a long time. She also supposedly reported a conversation where Anne had told her that the king was not a man to satisfy a woman, implying he was impotent. This was twisted into a motive for Anne seeking satisfaction elsewhere, even with her own brother. There was no other credible evidence. No love letters, no eyewitnesses to any inappropriate act. At his trial, George was asked to read aloud the written accusation of his specific crime. He read it out to the court, which was considered a breach of protocol. The details were apparently so shocking that many in the court were convinced of his guilt simply by the nature of the charge. He defended himself brilliantly, but the verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was found guilty of treason and incest. Historians are almost unanimous in their belief that this charge was a complete fabrication. Incest was the ultimate taboo. Accusing Anne of it was a way to paint her as unnatural, a monster who deserved to die. It also served a key political purpose. If Anne had committed incest, it suggested a deep-seated corruption within the entire Boleyn family. It helped to justify not just her death, but the fall of her entire faction. Why would Jane Rochford testify against her own husband? Some believe she was a jealous and spiteful woman who hated the Boleyns. Others suggest she was pressured by Cromwell, perhaps threatened into giving the evidence he needed. She may have thought she was saving herself, not realizing the terrible consequences of her words. Years later, before her own execution for her role in the affair of Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, she reportedly confessed that she had given false testimony against Anne and George. The charge of incest remains one of the darkest and most baseless smears in English history, a testament to the brutal political realities of the Tudor court. Number 15 were the charges of adultery completely fabricated. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery with 4 other men besides her brother Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and a court musician named Mark Smeaton. For a queen, adultery was treason. It threatened the succession, casting doubt on the legitimacy of any royal children. The punishment was death. The question that has echoed for centuries is, was any of it true? The evidence was almost non-existent. The case hinged on the confession of Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was a commoner, a talented musician of Flemish origin. Unlike the other accused men who were aristocrats, Smeaton was vulnerable. He was arrested and taken to Thomas Cromwell's house in Stepney. There he was interrogated. It is widely believed he was subjected to intense pressure, perhaps even physical torment, to get him to confess. He broke and admitted to having a relationship with the Queen. He was the only one of the accused to do so. The other 4 men, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and George Boleyn, all maintained their innocence to the very end. The accusations against the others were based on flimsy gossip and out-of-context remarks. For example, Anne was said to have had a conversation with Henry Norris, a close friend of the king. She supposedly chided him for visiting her chambers so often, asking him why he was delaying his own marriage. "You look for dead men's shoes," she reportedly said, "for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." It was a clumsy, foolish joke, implying he hoped to marry her if the king died. In the paranoid atmosphere of the court, it was twisted into evidence of a treasonous affair. The timeline of the alleged affairs also makes little sense. The indictment listed numerous specific dates and places where the adultery supposedly occurred. But court records show that on many of those dates, Anne and the accused man were not in the same place. She might have been at Greenwich while he was in London. These were details the prosecution either ignored or didn't bother to check, assuming no one would dare question them. Most historians today are convinced that the charges were a frame-up. Anne was known for her flirtatious manner, a style she had learned at the French court. She was witty and enjoyed verbal sparring with the men around her. This behavior, which was acceptable in France, was seen as improper and dangerous for an English queen. Her enemies and a king, desperate to be rid of her, used this against her. They took her words, her friendships, and her open demeanor and wove them into a tale of treason and betrayal. Mark Smeaton's coerced confession gave them the one piece of proof they needed to make the whole case stick. The trials were a sham, designed to produce one outcome: guilty. Number 14, did she miscarry a deformed fetus? On January 29, 1536, Anne Boleyn miscarried. It was a devastating blow. She had been pregnant for several months, and everyone hoped for a prince. The king had taken a serious fall from his horse just days earlier and was unconscious for a time, a shock that Anne later said caused the miscarriage. When the fetus was examined, it was said to be a male. This was her last chance to give Henry the son he so desperately wanted. The failure sealed her fate. Decades later, a new, more sinister detail was added to this story. Nicholas Sander, an English Catholic exile writing propaganda against Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, wrote a book in the 1580s. In it, he claimed that Anne had miscarried not just a fetus, but a shapeless mass of flesh. He described it in monstrous terms. This story was a powerful piece of anti-Boleyn propaganda. Sanders' goal was to delegitimize Elizabeth by painting her mother as an unnatural monster. A deformed fetus would be proof of Anne's supposed witchcraft and her incestuous relationship with her brother. It would be a sign of God's judgment on her unnatural union with the king. The problem is that there is no contemporary evidence for this at all. None of the reports from 1536, not even from Anne's worst enemy, the Spanish ambassador Chapuis, mention anything about the fetus being deformed. Chapuis reported the miscarriage in great detail, noting that it was a male fetus of about 3.5 months. If there had been any hint of deformity, he would have certainly reported it to his master, as it would have been powerful ammunition against Anne. The court was full of people who would have been happy to spread such a damaging rumor, but there was silence. The story appears to have been invented by Sander, writing 50 years after the event, in a different country, for a clear political purpose. He also promoted other outlandish rumors about Anne, including the one about her having 6 fingers and a projecting tooth. His work was highly influential, and the story of the deformed fetus was repeated for centuries, often accepted as fact. Modern historians dismiss Sanders' account as pure fiction. A miscarriage at that stage of pregnancy would naturally result in a fetus that was not fully formed, which could be misinterpreted or deliberately misreported as deformed. But the idea of a monstrous birth was a fabrication designed to posthumously convict Anne in the court of public opinion. It was a powerful rumor because it played on deep-seated fears about witchcraft, sin, and divine punishment. It was a lie that served to justify her execution long after she was dead. Number 13, was she a true Protestant reformer or just using religion for power? Anne Boleyn was instrumental in the English Reformation. Her refusal to be Henry's mistress and his desire to marry her led directly to the break with the Roman Catholic Church. Because of this, she has often been hailed as a Protestant hero, a champion of the new faith. She owned a copy of William Tyndale's forbidden English translation of the Bible and openly protected and promoted clergymen with reformist ideas like Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Shaxton. She appointed many of them as bishops and as her own personal chaplains. This was a brave and dangerous thing to do. Her personal faith seems to have been genuine. She was deeply interested in the idea that salvation came through faith alone, a core Protestant belief. She believed the Bible should be available to everyone in their own language. She encouraged the king to read reformist books that argued for the supremacy of the king over the pope. This, of course, also served her own interests, as the pope was the one man standing in the way of her marriage to Henry. Her private prayer book, which still survives, is filled with personal notes and prayers that suggest deep and thoughtful piety. However, her enemies and even some, skeptical historians have questioned the sincerity of her beliefs. They argue that her support for the Reformation was purely a matter of political convenience. She needed to break the power of the Pope to become queen. Supporting religious reform was the way to do it. It gave a theological and moral justification for what was essentially a dynastic power grab. They point out that while she promoted some Protestant ideas, she still attended Mass and participated in Catholic rituals, as everyone in England did at the time. The line between late medieval Catholicism and early Protestantism was blurry. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis called her a she-devil and saw her as the prime mover behind the heresy infecting England. To Catholics at the time, her motives were clear. She used religion to satisfy her ambition, but to the reformers she protected, she was a godly patron. William Tyndale, even from exile, praised her. One reformer, William Latimer, later wrote a biography of her, portraying her as a virtuous and pious queen who was brought down by her Catholic enemies at court. The most likely truth is that her motives were mixed. She was a genuinely pious woman, drawn to the new ideas of the Reformation. She saw the corruption in the old church and believed in the power of Scripture. At the same time, she was a brilliant and ambitious political operator. She understood that these new religious ideas could be used to achieve her goals. Her faith and her ambition were not separate things. They were completely intertwined. She believed her cause was righteous, and she used the tools of religious reform to fight for it. Whether you see her as a saint or a schemer depends entirely on which side you were on. Number 12, was she a cruel and vengeful queen? Anne Boleyn's reputation for cruelty comes mainly from her treatment of two people, Catherine of Aragon and her daughter Mary Tudor. From the moment Anne became queen, she was determined to be acknowledged as the one and only queen of England. This meant Catherine and Mary had to accept her new status, which they steadfastly refused to do. Catherine was stripped of her title, referred to as the Dowager Princess of Wales, and moved from one damp, isolated castle to another. Her household was reduced, and she was forbidden from communicating with her daughter Mary. This was largely Henry's doing, but Anne was seen as the driving force behind it. Anne reportedly said she would like to send Mary to serve as a maid in her own household so she could give her a good beating for her defiance. She was also heard to say that she would not rest until Mary's head was off her shoulders. These remarks, reported by the hostile ambassador Chapuis, paint a picture of a jealous and vindictive woman. Mary Tudor suffered greatly during Anne's reign. After Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, an act of succession was passed declaring Mary illegitimate and removing her from the line of succession. She was forced to give up her title of princess, and her own household was dissolved. She was then sent to live in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, essentially as a lady in waiting. She was bullied and pressured to accept her father's new marriage and the new religious order. When she refused, she lived in constant fear for her life. It's easy to see why Mary would grow up to hate the memory of Anne Boleyn. But was Anne uniquely cruel, or was she simply a product of her time? The Tudor court was a brutal place. Power was a life or death game. Catherine and Mary were not just a private family matter, they were a massive political problem. As long as they refused to accept the new reality, they were a rallying point for all of Henry's enemies, both in England and across Europe. Their defiance was a direct threat to Anne's position as queen and to the legitimacy of her daughter, Elizabeth. From Anne's perspective, their stubbornness was treasonous. Her harsh words and actions, while shocking to us, might have been seen as a necessary response to a dangerous political threat. She could also be kind and generous. Records show she was a charitable queen, giving large amounts of money to the poor and to educational causes. Her household accounts show her taking care of her servants and their families. People who supported her, especially the religious reformers, saw her as a virtuous and godly patron. The image of her as a cruel monster was largely created and spread by her enemies. They saw her as the woman who had destroyed a beloved queen and tormented a princess. Like so much about Anne, the truth of her character depends on whose report you read. Number 11 was their secret marriage in 1532 or 1533. The exact date of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn is a point of historical confusion. For centuries, it was believed that they married in a secret ceremony on January 25th, 1533. This is the date recorded by the chronicler Edward Hall, who was writing at the time. It is also the date that Archbishop Thomas Cranmer later referred to. The ceremony was supposedly held early in the morning in a private room at Whitehall Palace. Only a handful of witnesses were present. This date makes sense. By January 1533, Anne was already pregnant with the future Queen Elizabeth I. A marriage was urgently needed to ensure the child would be born legitimate. The new session of Parliament was about to begin, and Henry and Cromwell were preparing the final legislative push to break with Rome. Marrying in January gave them a few months before the marriage was publicly announced, and Anne was crowned queen in June. However, there is another theory based on a different piece of evidence. A letter written by a clergyman named Thomas Loupset in late 1532 seems to suggest that a secret marriage had already taken place. The theory goes that Henry and Anne married in an even more secret ceremony in Dover on November 14th, 1532. They had just returned from a highly successful trip to Calais, France. During this trip, Anne had been treated as Henry's queen consort by the French king, Francis I, was a major diplomatic victory. It gave Henry the international recognition he needed to proceed with the marriage. According to this theory, the couple, flushed with their success in France and finally away from the prying eyes of the London court, decided to marry on their return to English soil. This would explain why Anne was willing to finally consummate her relationship with the king after years of holding out. She had the security of a marriage vow, even if it was a secret one. The January 25th ceremony, in this view, was a second, more formal but still secret ceremony, perhaps to be absolutely sure of the legality before the pregnancy was announced. So, which date is correct? Most mainstream historians still favor the January 25th, 1533 date. The evidence for it from Hall and Cranmer is more direct. The evidence for the November 1532 date is more circumstantial, but the debate continues. The confusion itself is revealing. It shows how carefully Henry had to move. He was defying the Pope and marrying a woman many of his subjects considered an adulteress. The marriage had to be done in stages, in secret, with the legal groundwork laid piece by piece. Whether the key date was in November or January, the marriage marked the point of no return for Henry, Anne, and the entire Kingdom of England. Number 10, did she refuse him for 7 years, or was that an exaggeration? The story of Anne Boleyn's long courtship with Henry VIII is legendary. It is often said that she resisted the king's advances for 7 years, refusing to become his mistress and holding out for the crown. This long wait, the story goes, is what drove Henry to his extreme actions, breaking with his wife of over 20 years and splitting from the Catholic Church. The 7-year itch has become a central part of the Anne Boleyn myth. The timeline roughly fits. Henry's interest in Anne seems to have started around 1526. His efforts to get an annulment from Catherine of Aragon began in earnest in 1527. He finally married Anne in late 1532 or early 1533. That is a span of about 6 or 7 years. During this time, Anne consistently refused to sleep with him. This was a radical and dangerous strategy. Kings were used to getting what they wanted. Royal mistresses were common. Anne's own sister Mary had been one. But Anne wanted more. She had seen what happened to discarded mistresses. She wanted to be queen. or nothing. Henry's love letters to her, which survive today, show his growing frustration and obsession. He writes of being stricken with the dart of love for over a year and complains about her reluctance. He promises her his heart, his body, and his loyalty if she will only give herself to him. Her refusal only seemed to make him more determined. He poured resources into the great matter, his quest for an annulment, spending a fortune on lawyers, scholars, and diplomats. But was it really a calculated 7-year plan from the start? Some historians think this gives Anne too much credit for foresight. It's more likely that her strategy evolved over time. Initially, she may have simply been trying to protect her reputation. As the king's obsession grew and the possibility of an annulment became more real, the ultimate prize, the crown, came into view. She and her family realized they had a chance to achieve something unimaginable. Her refusal to become his mistress then became her greatest weapon. It was the only leverage she had, and she used it brilliantly. It's also possible the 7-year timeline is a bit of an exaggeration. We don't know for sure exactly when Henry decided he wanted to marry her, rather than just have her as a mistress. The process of the annulment was long and complex, facing huge obstacles from the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. The delay wasn't just caused by Anne's refusal, it was caused by international politics and complex canon law. Anne's no kept Henry's interest alive during those long, frustrating years of legal and diplomatic wrangling. So while the 7 years figure might be a convenient shorthand, the core of the story is true. Her long and calculated refusal to be the king's mistress changed the course of history. Number 9, did she bewitch him with spells? When Henry VII's marriage to Anne Boleyn began to fall apart, he needed a reason. He couldn't just admit that he had made a mistake or that he had tired of her. He needed to believe that he had been tricked, that the marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. One of the explanations he seized upon was witchcraft. He claimed that he had been seduced and deceived by sorcery and spells. This accusation was not part of the formal charges brought against Anne at her trial in 1536. The official charges were adultery, incest, and treason, but the rumor of witchcraft hung in the air and was used to poison public opinion against her. The Spanish ambassador Chapois reported that the king spoke of it openly. It was a way for Henry to save face. It meant his infatuation with Anne wasn't his fault. He had been a victim of dark arts. It also explained why God had not blessed their union with a son. The marriage was based on an evil deception, so of course it would be fruitless. What evidence was there for this? It was all based on rumor and insinuation. Anne was different from other women at the English court. She was intelligent, outspoken, and had a sharp wit. She had spent years in the sophisticated courts of Europe, particularly France, and her manners and style were seen as foreign and suspect. She debated theology with the king and had strong opinions on politics. To her supporters, this made her exciting and modern. To her enemies, it made her seem unnatural and dangerous. A woman with that much influence over a king must have used some kind of magic. The rumors about her physical appearance were also used as proof of her witchcraft. Later Catholic propaganda, written by Nicholas Sander, claimed she had a 6th finger on one hand, a large mole or wen on her neck, and a projecting tooth. In the 16th century, physical deformities were often seen as marks of the devil. These stories were almost certainly exaggerations or complete fabrications. Contemporary accounts describe her as being stylish and having beautiful dark eyes, but no one at the time mentioned these deformities. They were invented after her death to make the witchcraft charge seem more plausible. The charge of witchcraft was never seriously pursued in court, probably because it would have been too difficult to prove and would have made the king look weak and foolish for being so easily duped. But it served its purpose. It destroyed Anne's reputation and helped to turn public opinion against her. It provided a simple superstitious explanation for a complex political and personal drama. The king had not made a catastrophic error of judgment, he had been bewitched. Number 8, did she genuinely love Henry, or was it all ambition? This is one of the most fundamental and unanswerable questions about Anne Boleyn. Was she a cold, calculating schemer who played a long game to win a crown, or was she a woman who fell in love with a charismatic king and was caught up in a whirlwind of events beyond her control? The evidence can be read both ways. The case for ambition is strong. Anne refused to be Henry's mistress, a position her own sister had held. She held out for marriage, a move of breathtaking audacity. This suggests a clear-headed and ambitious plan. She saw an opportunity to rise higher than any woman in her family ever had, and she took it. Her family, particularly her father, Thomas Boleyn, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, were notoriously ambitious. It's easy to see her as a pawn in their dynastic games, or as an even more ambitious player than they were. Her motto was the most happy, and she seemed to revel in the power and status she gained as queen. However, there is also evidence that she had genuine feelings for Henry. When their relationship began, Henry was still a magnificent figure. He was handsome, athletic, intelligent, and charming. He was one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. It is entirely plausible that a young woman at court would have been genuinely captivated by him. His surviving love letters to her are passionate and full of adoration. It is hard to believe their relationship could have been sustained for so many years on ambition alone. There must have been a real emotional connection between them. Some of the stories from their time together suggest a genuine, if volatile, affection. They shared interests in music, theology, and hunting. They argued, they flirted, they were a dynamic and passionate couple. When she finally became pregnant, their joy seems to have been real. Later, during her trial, she reportedly spoke of the king with affection, believing until the very end that he would save her. In her final speech on the scaffold, she did not curse him. Instead, she spoke mildly, praising him as a gentle and sovereign lord. This could be seen as a final, pragmatic attempt to protect her daughter, Elizabeth, or it could be seen as the words of a woman who, despite everything, still held some feeling for the man she had once loved and who was now sending her to her death. Most likely, the truth is a complex mix of both love and ambition. These two motives are not mutually exclusive. She could have been genuinely in love with the king, while also being keenly aware of the power and status that came with his affection. She was an intelligent woman who understood the world she lived in. She knew that love in a royal court was always tied to power. She played the game, and for a time she won. To reduce her to either a romantic heroine or a heartless schemer is to misunderstand the complicated reality of her life. Number 7, did her family ruthlessly push her towards the king? The Boleyn family's rise was spectacular. They went from being respectable gentry to being one of the most powerful families in England in a single generation. This was largely due to the ambition of Sir Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father. He was a skilled diplomat and courtier who used his talents and his children to advance his family's position. Because of this, the Boleyns are often seen as a greedy, grasping clan who pushed their daughters into the king's bed for their own gain. The story of Mary Boleyn, Anne's older sister, seems to support this view. Mary was sent to court and became Henry VIII's mistress for a time in the early 1520s. The family clearly benefited from this arrangement, receiving titles and grants of land from the king. When the king's affair with Mary ended and his eyes fell on Anne, it's easy to imagine Thomas Boleyn and his powerful brother-in-law, the Duke of Norfolk, encouraging Anne to play her cards right to secure even greater rewards for the family. They certainly reaped the benefits of Anne's relationship with the king. During the years of the Great Matter, Thomas Boleyn was made Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond. Her brother George was given the title Lord Rochford. They were given key positions at court and became central figures in the king's government. The family's power was completely tied to Anne's success. This suggests they were active participants in her strategy, coaching her and managing the political fallout. The Duke of Norfolk, a conservative Catholic, disliked the religious changes Anne was promoting, but he supported her rise to power because it benefited the Howard family. However, this might be too simplistic a view. It takes away Anne's own agency. Anne was not a passive pawn. She was highly intelligent, educated, and had a strong will of her own. She had spent years at the sophisticated courts of Margaret of Austria and the French king, where she saw powerful women wield influence. It is just as likely that she was the one driving the strategy, not her father or uncle. She may have seen the king's interest in her and decided for herself how to play the situation to her best advantage. While her family certainly supported her and benefited from her rise, the idea that they were a cabal of pimps who forced her into the king's arms is probably an exaggeration created by their enemies. The Boleyns were an ambitious family, like every other noble family at the Tudor court. They played the game of court politics, and for a while they played it better than anyone else. But Anne's decisions, her intelligence, and her determination were the real engine of their incredible ascent. They rode her coattails to power, but she was the one in the lead. Number 6, was she sent to France to be schooled or to be hidden away? Anne Boleyn spent a significant part of her youth, from about the age of 12 or 13 until her early 20s, living abroad. Around 1513, she was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Netherlands. A year later, she was transferred to the French court, where she served Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, who briefly became Queen of France. After Mary's husband died, Anne stayed on in France, joining the household of the new queen, Claude. She remained in France until about 1521. This European education was highly unusual for an English noblewoman at the time. It made Anne who she was. The courts she lived in were centers of Renaissance culture. She became fluent in French, developed a taste for French fashion, art, and music, and learned the sophisticated courtly manners of flirtation and witty conversation. This was the schooling that made her stand out so dramatically when she returned to the more conservative English court. She seemed exotic, stylish, and intelligent in a way that other English ladies were not. This was what first attracted men like Henry Percy and later the king himself. But there is a darker rumor about why she was in France for so long. This story was spread by her enemies, particularly the Catholic propagandist Nicholas Sander. He claimed that Anne was sent abroad to hide her promiscuous behavior. He wrote that she had been immoral as a young girl in England and that her father sent her to France, where she lived a scandalous life. This was part of Sander's broader effort to paint Anne as a corrupt and immoral woman from the very beginning. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence to support this slander. Being sent to a foreign court to be a maid of honor was a great privilege. It was a finishing school for the daughters of the highest nobility. Thomas Boleyn, a rising diplomat, was able to secure this prestigious placement for his daughter, which was a sign of his growing influence. It was an investment in her future, designed to make her a more desirable match for a high-ranking nobleman. It was a mark of honor, not shame. The years in France were formative. They gave Anne a confidence and a worldview that were different from her English contemporaries. She was exposed to the new religious ideas of the Reformation that were circulating on the continent. She saw powerful women like Margaret of Austria and Louise of Savoy, the French king's mother, wielding real political power. This experience undoubtedly shaped her own ambition and her belief that she could be more than just a wife and mother. Her time in France was the key to her later success, not a sordid secret to be hidden away. Number 5, how old was she really? It seems like a simple question, but we do not know for sure what year Anne Boleyn was born. There are no surviving records of her birth or baptism. For centuries, historians have argued over 2 possible dates, 1501 or 1507. This 6-year difference is significant. It changes how we see her and her actions. The traditional date, long accepted by many, was 1507. This date was proposed by a 17th century writer and was based on a letter written in 1514 that refers to Thomas Boleyn's daughter being in the Netherlands. The writer assumed this must have been the younger daughter, Anne, and that she must have been very young, around 7 years old. If she was born in 1507, it would mean she was only about 19 or 20 when she caught the king's eye in 1526. It would make her a teenager when she began her calculated refusal to be his mistress. It would also mean she was not yet 30 when she was executed. This narrative paints her as a very young, perhaps more vulnerable figure. However, most modern historians, led by the work of Eric Ives, now strongly favor the earlier date of 1501. The evidence for this is more compelling. We know that Anne was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in 1513 to be a maid of honor. The position was not for a child of 6 or 7. It required a certain level of maturity and social grace. A girl of 12 or 13, born in 1501, would have been a much more suitable candidate. Furthermore, a letter from Anne herself written in her own hand in 1514 survives. The handwriting and the sophisticated French it is written in are far too advanced for a 7-year-old. If Anne was born in 1501, it means she was in her mid-20s when her relationship with Henry began. She was a mature and experienced woman of the world, not a teenager. She would have been around 26, the same age as her rival, Henry Percy, when their romance was broken up. When she became queen in 1533, she was 32. At her death in 1536, she was around 35. This makes her a contemporary of Henry's, not a much younger woman. It makes her calculated political strategy and her influence over the king seem more plausible. She was his intellectual and political equal, a mature partner in his great matter. The debate isn't fully settled, but the consensus has shifted. Believing she was born in 1501 gives us a picture of a more formidable and experienced woman. The mystery surrounding her birth date is a small but important reminder of how much we don't know for sure about the lives of even the most famous women in history. Number 4. Was she really Henry's own daughter? This is one of the most scandalous and persistent rumors about Anne Boleyn. The story goes that during the time her older sister Mary was the king's mistress, her mother, Elizabeth Howard, also had an affair with Henry VIII. The result of this supposed affair was Anne. If true, it would mean that Henry sought to marry his own illegitimate daughter, a sin of shocking proportions. This rumor was spread by Henry's enemies, particularly those who wanted to support Catherine of Aragon and her daughter Mary. It was a way to make his obsession with Anne seem even more unnatural and depraved. The main source for this story comes from the work of Nicholas Sander, the same Catholic propagandist who wrote about Anne's sixth finger and deformed fetus. He wrote his book 50 years after the events, and his goal was to destroy the reputation of Anne and her daughter, Queen Elizabeth. Sanders' version is full of lurid details. He claimed that Thomas Boleyn, upon discovering his wife's affair with the king, tried to stop it, but was bought off with promotions. The story was designed to discredit the entire Boleyn family, painting them as corrupt and immoral from top to bottom. Is there any truth to it? Almost certainly not. There is no contemporary evidence at all to support the rumor. No one at the time, not even the Spanish ambassador Chapuis, who hated Anne and reported every piece of negative gossip he could find, ever mentioned this story. If such a shocking rumor had been circulating at court, he would have written about it. In 1533, when Henry was pushing his marriage to Anne through Parliament, one member of Parliament, Sir George Throckmorton, did raise some uncomfortable questions. He was worried that the king had had affairs with both Anne's mother and her sister. Henry, when he heard about this, became very angry. He spoke to Throckmorton directly. He admitted to the affair with Mary Boleyn, but swore on his royal word that he had never had a relationship with her mother. Henry needed his marriage to Anne to be seen as legitimate and blessed by God. If there was any truth to the rumor that Anne was his daughter, it would have been a massive canonical impediment to the marriage, far worse than his marriage to his brother's widow, Catherine. He would never have pursued the marriage for 7 years if he believed he was trying to marry his own child. The rumor was a piece of malicious slander invented long after Anne's death to attack her memory and the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty she founded. Number 3, was she beautiful or plain? We have no confirmed contemporary portrait of Anne Boleyn. The famous portraits we see today, like the one in the National Portrait Gallery in London, were all painted decades after her death. They are likely copies of a lost original, but we can't be sure how accurate they are. This lack of a definitive image has allowed for a great deal of debate about what she actually looked like. Was she a great beauty, or was there something else about her that captivated the king? Her enemies certainly didn't think she was beautiful. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis, who was biased, described her as being not one of the handsomest women in the world. He noted she was of a swarthy complexion, which was not considered fashionable at a time when pale skin was prized. He also mentioned she had a long neck and a mouth that was too wide. Nicholas Sander, writing later, added the sensational details of a projecting tooth, a sixth finger, and a wen on her neck. These descriptions paint a picture of a woman who was plain at best and physically deformed at worst. However, those who were not her enemies described her very differently. A French diplomat, Lancelot de Carles, who saw her, wrote a poem describing her as beautiful. He praised her lovely mouth, and most of all, her eyes. This is the one feature everyone seemed to agree on. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and very expressive. He wrote that they were her greatest beauty, and that she knew how to use them. Another contemporary, the Venetian ambassador, described her as not handsome, but she has a good figure. He also mentioned her black and beautiful eyes. So what is the truth? She probably was not a conventional beauty by Tudor standards. She wasn't the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned ideal, but she clearly had something far more powerful: charisma, style, and intelligence. She was what the French would call jolie-eyed, a woman who is not conventionally beautiful, but is attractive and charming. She knew how to dress in the latest French fashions, how to dance, how to make witty conversation. She was dynamic and captivating. Her power lay not in a pretty face, but in her personality and her mesmerizing eyes. Henry VIII, who had been married to the conventionally attractive Catherine of Aragon, was clearly bored. Anne was something new and exciting. She stimulated his mind as well as his desires. The debate about her looks shows that her appeal was complex. She wasn't just a pretty face for the king to admire. She was a woman whose charm and power came from within, from her confidence, her wit, and her ability to hold the most powerful man in the kingdom completely spellbound. Number 2, was she a witch? The accusation of witchcraft is one of the darkest rumors surrounding Anne Boleyn. It was never a formal charge in her indictment, but it was a powerful undercurrent that helped to justify her downfall. The king himself claimed he had been bewitched into marrying her. This claim served a dual purpose. It absolved him of responsibility for the disastrous marriage, and it painted Anne as an evil, unnatural force. The evidence for her being a witch was entirely based on rumor and her perceived otherness. Her years in France had given her a sophistication and confidence that seemed foreign to the English court. She was intelligent and politically astute, unafraid to voice her opinions on matters of state and religion. In an age that expected women to be meek and submissive, Anne's assertiveness could be interpreted as unnatural. If a woman had that much power over a king, surely she must have used magic. Then there were the rumors about her physical appearance, spread by Catholic propagandists after her death. The most famous is the claim that she had a sixth finger on her right hand. Other tales mentioned a large, unsightly mole on her neck, which she supposedly covered with the high-necked gowns and pearl chokers that she made fashionable. In the superstitious world of the 16th century, such physical abnormalities were often considered marks of a witch. There is no credible contemporary source that mentions these deformities. Those who knew her wrote about her style and her expressive eyes, not extra fingers. The stories were almost certainly invented later to bolster the witchcraft narrative. Her failure to produce a healthy male heir was also twisted into proof of her evil nature. She gave birth to a healthy daughter, Elizabeth, but then suffered a series of miscarriages. Her final miscarriage in January 1536 of a male fetus was the last straw for Henry. In his mind, this was a sign of God's judgment. He had married a witch, and God was punishing him by denying him a son. The later rumor that this fetus was deformed fed directly into the witchcraft story. A monstrous woman would naturally produce a monstrous child. The accusation of witchcraft was a powerful political weapon. It didn't need to be proven in a court of law. It just needed to be whispered in the corridors of power and among the common people. It dehumanized Anne, turning her from a queen into a monster. It made it easier for people to accept the shocking spectacle of a Queen of England being tried and executed for treason. It was the ultimate slander designed to destroy not just her life, but her very humanity. Number 1, did she have a sixth finger? Of all the juicy rumors about Anne Boleyn, the story of her having a sixth finger is the most famous and enduring. It is a striking and memorable detail, one that seems to offer a physical clue to her supposedly dark and mysterious character. The story alleges that she had a small extra finger, or at least the beginning of one, on one of her hands, usually said to be her right hand. This rumor did not come from anyone who actually knew her or saw her at the Tudor court. It was first written down by a man named Nicholas Sander, an English Catholic, who was a fierce opponent of Anne's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. He wrote his book, Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism, in the 1580s, about 50 years after Anne's death. His goal was to prove that the English Reformation was founded on sin and corruption, and that Elizabeth was the illegitimate daughter of a monstrous heretic. Sander described Anne in gruesome detail. He wrote, "She had a projecting tooth under the upper lip, and on her right hand 6 fingers. There was a large wen under her chin, and therefore to hide its ugliness, she wore a high dress covering her throat." This is the sole origin of the 6-finger story. Sander was writing propaganda, not objective history. He was creating a caricature of a witch to serve his political and religious agenda. In the 16th century, physical deformities were seen as an outward sign of inner evil or God's displeasure. A 6th finger was a classic mark of a witch. Is there any truth to it? Absolutely not. No contemporary account of Anne, even from her worst enemies like Ambassador Chapois, ever mentions this. If the Queen of England had such a noticeable physical feature, someone would have written about it. She was a public figure, constantly on display. She was known for her elegant hands and long fingers, and she played musical instruments like the lute, which would have been very difficult with a malformed hand. The story is a complete fabrication, so why has it persisted for so long? Because it's a powerful image. It makes Anne seem strange and otherworldly. It fits neatly with the other dark rumors about her, that she was a witch who used spells to enchant the king. The image of the beautiful, dark-eyed queen with a hidden, monstrous secret is compelling. It has been repeated in countless books and movies, cementing it in the popular imagination. The story of the 6th finger tells us nothing about the real Anne Boleyn, but it tells us a great deal about how her enemies wanted her to be remembered. They couldn't just disagree with her politics or her religion. They had to make her physically monstrous, a witch, a sinner, marked by a hideous deformity. It was a lie, but it was a lie that has lasted for nearly 500 years.